how now how the startups or startup entities can be valued or are valued. So number one, for the valuation of startup, the first approach that can be applied for the valuation is known as market approach. And under the market approach, the first method which is used for the purpose of valuation is PORI, and PORI is price of recent investment. That means what? That means जो जो आप नया वैल्यूएशन करने जा रहे हैं, उस वैल्यूएशन के लिए आप जो रीसेंट इन्वेस्टमेंट हुआ है इस स्टार्टअप में, वो किस वैल्यूएशन के बेसिस पर हुआ है, दैट बिकम्स द स्टार्टिंग पॉइंट फॉर द पर्पस ऑफ वैल्यूएशन. एंड देन व्हाट यू डू subsequent to that PORI, that is प्राइस ऑफ रिसेंट इन्वेस्टमेंट, तो वो इन्वेस्टमेंट के बाद में जो भी डेवलपमेंट हुए हैं उन डेवलपमेंट के लिए क्या प्राइसिंग, इंक्रीमेंटल प्राइसिंग होगी, दैट इज व्हाट यू विल ऐड टू द प्राइस ऑफ अ रिसेंट इन्वेस्टमेंट टू फाइंड आउट द वैल्यूएशन of a startup enterprise. And then you also have the method of port. So port is price of recent transaction. So investment will be with regard to infusion of new capital, and port price of transaction will be with regard to the entire company, and that is your price of recent transaction. So these are the two methods that you will use for the purpose of valuation of a startup entity from the perspective of market approach. Then what you will also do, you will use the comparable transaction. Now not only you use the price of recent transaction, but you also use the comparable transaction. And remember, comparable transaction in case of a startup enterprise is not any way different than the comparable transactions that we have discussed all along this while. So they are applied in the same way as we have discussed in other contexts. So that is your market approach for the valuation of startup enterprise. The number two approach is the income approach. Now, in my view, and please pay attention, friends, in my view, maybe for infusion of equity by a venture capital fund, for infusion of capital by friends and relatives, for infusion of capital by a private equity fund, uh, you can use PORI, you can use port, you can use comparable transaction, you can use anything that you want to use it for. And that is because perhaps at that stage, at the stage of seed capital, at the stage of venture capital infusion, at the stage of private equity infusion, perhaps the project is not so well developed to get an idea as to what kind of cash flow it is going to have going forward. And therefore, up to the stage of private equity infusion, you can use whichever method that you want to use. You can certainly do it. But once the private equity infusion has taken place, it is expected and it should happen that when private equity has come in and they have put the money, कम से कम उस स्टेज पे तो startup enterprise should be in a position to tell confidently, if not 100% confident, at least 70% confidence, that what are going to be my revenues over next 10 years, 15 years, 20 years. What are going to be my expenses over 10 years, 15 years, 20 years? What is going to be my cash flow from the operations of the company over next 10 years, 15 years, and 20 years? And therefore, after the private equity infusion, the valuation of a startup, in my view, should only be done based on the discounted cash flow. एंड वाई इट शुड बी बेस्ड ऑन द डिस्काउंटेड कैश फ्लो, क्योंकि अगर प्राइवेट इक्विटी की फंड आने के बावजूद भी अगर वो स्टार्टअप ये बता नहीं पा रहा है कि उसके रेवेन्यूज़ क्या होंगे और उसका एक्सपेंसेस क्या होंगे, उसका कैश फ्लो क्या होगा फ्यूचर में, तो फिर उस स्टार्टअप की क्या गारंटी है कि वो सरवाइव करेगा या सस्टेन करेगा या ग्रो करेगा? कुछ भी गारंटी नहीं है. And therefore, even though a lot of people say in case of a startup, it is difficult to do the evaluation because information is not available. It is understood. Up to the stage of seed capital, information is not available. Agreed. Up to the stage of infusion of venture capital, information is not available. Agreed. Up to the stage of infusion of private equity capital, information is not available about the cash flow of the company. Agreed. Understood. But आफ्टर द इन्फ्यूजन ऑफ प्राइवेट इक्विटी, तब तक तो वो जो स्टार्टअप है पूरी तरह से डेवलप हो जाना चाहिए, जो उनको इंफ्रास्ट्रक्चर चाहिए वो पूरा तैयार हो जाना चाहिए. तो वो सब एवरीथिंग शुड बी इन प्लेस. एंड देयरफॉर फ्रॉम द पॉइंट आफ्टर इन्फ्यूजन ऑफ equity capital by the private equity, उसके बाद में अगर वैल्यूएशन करना है किसी स्टार्टअप का फॉर द आईपीओ और अदरवाइज, इन माय व्यू दैट वैल्यूएशन should only be done based on discounted cash flow method. If someone says it is not possible because those information are not available, then my recommendation will be let the startup pay to the professional chartered accountant, cost accountant, company secretaries, financial experts. Pay them something. These professionals will help the startup in making the business plan, and that business plan then becomes the basis for the purpose of finding out the valuation of the purpose of the finding for the purpose of finding out the cash flow of the company. And based on that cash flow of the company, it would be possible to determine value of that company. And I'm sure, friends, if this is what is followed, then all the fiascos that we have seen in the past with regard to the startup venture, that they're coming out with huge premiums and their stock prices tanking on the stock markets, that in my view will not happen. So that's your income approach. And the third approach is the cost approach. Now, in my view, cost approach is not applicable definitely in case of a startup enterprise. And why it is not applicable in case of a startup enterprise at any stage? Cost approach is not applicable at the seed capital stage or at the venture capital stage or at the private equity stage or even at the IPO stage. And why is that so? And that is because value of a startup is not derived from the value of the asset it owns. Value of a startup is derived from the cash flow that it is going to generate over the years. And therefore, in my view, the cost approach will not be applicable or will not be relevant for the purpose of valuation of a startup enterprise. Friends, I hope this makes sense to every one of you.
Yes, first class.
Excellent. Prasanna ji?
Yes, yes, yes.
Okay, very good. Very good. Very good.